Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Kuf Yud Zayin Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today in two lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch on Kuf Tez Zayin Amid Beis, Siman Shin Yud Beis, Sif Aleph, by the words of the Ramah Haga Yesh Oimrim. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kabeis Yisrael Hanasunim Basaru Bashivya Ha'im Debei Bayom Abein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachim Alehem V'Yitzim Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'Oira Mishiba L'Geula Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Esther Fradl Bas Chana Meshameir Ben Esther Fradl Rafal Yisrael Menachem Ben Ita Ginendel Chavadasa Bas Serel. They should have a Refuah Shalem B'Basai Shar Chil Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yonasan Ben Michal, Yoel Ben Michal. The Rabbi Shalom should watch over them together with all of our other brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol Makom Shehem. So we've been speaking here in Siman Shin Yud Beis about the heter that Chazal gave for one who is going to the Beis HaKisei and he needs to use a stone, a flat, smooth stone, to use it to clean himself. This was what people did back in the day. Stones, of course, by default, are considered muksa machmas gufay. Yet, because of kavod habriyos, for the sake of human dignity, Chazal relaxed the halacha of muksa over here, and they allow one to be metaltal avanim, to handle such stones for this purpose. We've spoken about how many stones you're allowed to collect. That was all in the previous year. Now it says the Ramah Haga, Yesh Oimrim Dafka Bechotzer Mutal Taltal Avanim. We have dealt until now with the Isser of Tiltal Muktzah, and we've said that Chazal wa matir the Tiltal Muktzah on these stones that would otherwise be considered Muktzah for the sake of Kavod Habriyos. But now, how about the Isser of Hoitzah? How about transporting these stones from one rishus to another? So says the Ramah, Yesh Oimrim, there are those that say Dafka B'chotzer Mutal Taltal Avanim. Yes, Chazal wa matir the Isser Tiltal Muktzah, they allow you to handle one of these stones in a chotzer. But the Yesh Oimrim, there are those that are more makel and say Da'afilu mi karmelis l'rishos hayachid nami shari. Not only is the Isser Muktzah relaxed over here, but we'll even relax the Isser Hoitzah D'Rabbanan and allow you to transfer these stones from a karmelis, which is a rishos D'Rabbanan, to a rishos hayachid, or I would assume from the rishos hayachid out to the karmelis. So we'll relax this Issa D'Rabbanan as well, and that's what the Ramah says now. Dahanami ain't a rak Issa D'Rabbanan, because we're talking over here about Isurei D'Rabbanan. This is not Hoitzah D'Araisa. Hoitzah D'Araisa is from a Rishus HaYachid to a bona fide Rishus HaRabim, or vice versa. But from a Rishus HaYachid to a Karmelis, from a Karmelis to Rishus HaYachid, is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. So if we see that Chazal relaxed the Isser of Tiltal Muktzah, we could also say that they relaxed the Isser of Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. Umishum Kavod Habriyos Hitiruhu. There's a bir halacha over here, a short bir halacha. Dibra Maschel Dahanami Einoi. You see, when you look at this Ramah, basically the Ramah is bringing down two opinions, right? The Ramah says one opinion, we're not. Listen, we're going to be matir tiltal muktzah, which is an Isser D'Rabbanan, because of Kavod Habriyos, but we're not going to relax the Isser of Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. The second opinion says no. The same way we relax the Isser Tiltal Muktzah, which is an Isser D'Rabbanan, we'll also relax the Isser of Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. Sounds like a very logical argument, right? Why would it be that we wouldn't be matir the Isser of Hoitzah D'Rabbanan? Muktzah is a D'Rabbanan, this is Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. Why not? Says the Bir Halacha over here, Dahanami Einoi, Vav Sheyesh Bazeh Shnei Isurin D'Rabbanan. In the case where you want to allow somebody to transfer the stone from a Karmelis to a Rishos HaYachid, or a Rishos HaYachid to a Karmelis, now you want to be matir two Isurei D'Rabbanan. Like the Bir Halacha says, Tiltal Muktzah, right? There's the original heter, the heter of Tiltal Muktzah, the gam mikarmelus l'rishos hayachid. Now you also want to add to that a second Issa D'Rabbanan of Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. According to the Yesh Oimim that's matir this, it's because again of Kavod Abrius. But now from this Biur Halacha we could maybe understand the first opinion that says no, we're not matir Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. Because you're right, we're being matir Tiltal Muktzah, which is a D'Rabbanan. It seems to be on the same level as Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. So if we can be matir one, why can't we be matir the other? But there's a difference between being matir 2 Isurei D'Rabbanan and being matir 1 Isur D'Rabbanan. That seems to be what's at play over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'yesh Harmim Da'afil L'Bikamelus, V'chein Iker. First, the Mishnah Berurah says that that's the Iker Halacha. He brings this down from the Eliyah Rabbah, that yes, you could be matir the Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. Now, the Mishnah Berurah just adds in something. Or Rishus HaRabim Didon. How about our contemporary Rishus Harabims? You go out into the street. Most of our streets, according to many Shitas, are not bona fide Rishus Harabims. We've said this many times. They're not a Mokum Hiluch Shisha Ribu. You don't have 600,000 people traveling them each day. Maybe they're not 16 amas wide. So most of our streets don't seem to fit the model of a real Rishus Harabim. So then they would be Carmelisan. So would this halacha apply to our streets? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Rishus Harabim didon, av shalaharbe paiskim dina kekarmelis, even though according to many paiskim our streets are really a karmelis, not a Rishus Harabim, mikamokan ein lahakel, we shouldn't be makel when it comes to our streets. And probably because this is a major machlokes. According to some, our streets are considered a Rishus Harabim. Okay, moving along to Sif Beis, end of the line, top line, Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. So you have these stones that you want to use for kinuach, that you want to use to clean yourself after using the Beis HaKisei. Says the Mechaber, Im yardu gishamim al ha'avonim v'nitbu. Let's say you were metaltal one of these stones, you brought it with you to the Beis HaKisei, you put it down on the ground, it's raining, it's very muddy, and the stone sank into the ground. And now, in order to use it, you want to pick it up and extract it from the ground. So, if the stones were rained upon, v'nitbu, and they sunk somewhat into the ground. Says the Mechaber, im rishuman nikar, if it's still obvious where they are, which the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, that means that you could still see them above the ground. They're not completely submerged in the ground. Then mutter litlan, you're allowed to pick them up, extract them from the ground, kedei lekaneach, in order to use them for kinuach. Ve'ein bazeh mishum soiser, and you don't have an issue here of the malacha of soiser. Ve'loi mishum teichein, nor do you have a problem here of the isser of teichein, which is grinding. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah for some explanation. Says the Mishnah Berurah's cut and test, al ha'avonim, rain fell on these stones. Hainu, she'echnizan mitchila lekanech behen. You brought these stones into the Beis HaKisei to use them. V'achakach yardu alein gishamim, and now rain has fallen upon them. V'nitbu'u b'karka, and they sank into the ground, oy betit, or into the mud. The Mechaber said, if they are rishuman nikar, literally it means that the roishim, the impression, the form of the stone is still recognizable. What does that mean, says the Mishnah Berurah? Hainu shenikarin lamaylo min akarka. You could still see part of the stone protruding above the ground. You look at the ground and you can see that's where the stone is. So that the stone did not become completely submerged in the ground. The Mechaber said in that case you could extract the stone, and there's ein boy mishum soiser v'loy mishum teichein. We do not have a problem of the malacha of soiser, stira, demolishing, or teichen, grinding. Why would we think we have soiser or teichen? Explains the Mishnah Berurah Tzana Leimar. What the Mechaber wants to say is, afilu im hayazeh be'ezer ritzpa shebechotzer. The Mishnah Berurah is learning over here that the Mechaber says you don't have a soiser problem. Why would you think you have a soiser problem in pulling a stone out of the ground? So he says, well, let's say it's not really the bare ground. Let's say there's some kind of ritzpah. Let's say it's some kind of a patio made out of stones. So don't think of a patio that's built out of big paving blocks. Think of a patio that's formed out of small stones, all pressed into the ground. Now, the stone that you brought here for use for kinuach, you put it down on this ritzpah, and it kind of sunk in, and it looks like it became part of the ritzpah. Now, by pulling it out, it kind of looks like you're pulling a stone out of the ritzpah. That's the way the Mishnah Berurah seems to be learning here. And now maybe it looks a little bit like stira. You might think that by pulling out the stone, it looks like you're doing seiser. Or it might look like you're maybe that the ground will crumble around it by pulling it out. Kamash Balan, Deshari, it seems that there isn't a real stira here, or a real teichen. It's maybe like a nireh. You might think that there's a possible problem. Says the Mechaber, no, there is not. Moving along to Sif Gimel, 3 lines down, says the Mechaber. Tzrar sha'olu by asavim. If you have a stone where literally this means that some kind of a grass-like growth grew on the stone. My understanding over here is this means that you have a stone that's covered with moss. Now, moss is kind of like a grass. It's very, very small, but it's a vegetation of some type that grows on the surface of the stone. Now, this is not moss that's growing on the ground. This is moss that's growing on the stone. Says the Mechaber, Tzror she'olu b'asavim, if you have a moss-covered stone, muter l'kaneach boy, you're still allowed to use it for kinuach purposes, v'lo yichayshin on shema yitlishu, and we do not have to be concerned that by using the stone, you're going to tear the moss off the stone, and you're going to violate the malacha of toilish, right? Toilish is a toilada of kaitzer, of harvesting. You're uprooting something from the place upon which it grows. Says the Mechaber, why is this not a problem? Da'afim yitlishu, because even if that does happen, leko isura, it's not usur. The davar she'ein miskavenu, because this is zicher, not your kavana. Your intention is not to uproot the moss off the stone. You want to use the stone to clean yourself. The problem is that by wiping the stone against your body, you may uproot some of the moss. Uprooting the moss could be seen as toilish. Now, indeed, were you to take the stone and intentionally scrape the moss off of the stone in order to remove the stone, to remove the moss, that would be the isser of toilish. But that's not what you're doing over here. Over here, this is a davar she'ein miskaven. You have no intent for the malacha of toilish. Therefore, says the Mechaber, it's mutter. Now, of course, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton Yud Beis, mutal lekaneach boy, you're allowed to use this stone for cleaning. Midasasam, because the Mechaber writes this in such a general way, mashba da'afilu munach ala aretz mutalitloi. It seems that you're allowed to pick up this moss-covered stone when it's laying on the ground. V'afti yesh bazal kol panav l'kulei alma iser talisha midirabanan. Now, to pick up a moss-covered stone, says the Mishnah Berurah, is toilish midirabanan. It's not toilish b'daraisa, because when you pick up a moss-covered stone, you're not uprooting anything from anywhere. The moss is growing on the stone. It's not growing on the ground. So when you pick up the moss-covered stone off the ground, you're not being toilish anything. But the Mishnah Berurah says that this would be tlisha b'darabanan, the mechsi k'toilish, because anybody who looks at this, right, you've got a stone covered with growth, with moss, you're pulling it off the ground. It's a mechzi k'toilish. This is not a maris ayin problem. That's not what this is. Even though we say mechzi k'toilish, it's a gzera problem. It's we don't want to allow you to do this because it looks like you're doing toilish. You might come to actually perform the malacha of toilish if we allow you to do this. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, to pick up that moss-covered stone would seem to be an issur d'Rabbanan. Yet, it's mutter if you're using the stone for kinuach. This is just another din d'Rabbanan that we're relaxing for the sake of kavod habriyos. So again, what did the Mishnah Berurah just say? Well, the Mechaber gave a flat-out heter. The Mechaber said you're allowed to use a moss-covered stone for kinuach. And he wrote it in a very general way. It's a blanket heter. Did he tell you you're allowed to use a moss-covered stone for kinuach if it's already separated from the ground? No. He just said you're allowed to use a moss-covered stone. So it would seem inherent in the language of the Mechaber that if you go to the base of Kisei and the stone that's available is a moss-covered stone and it's laying on the ground, you're allowed to pick it up. It's Toilish Midarabanan. That's okay. It's a Darabanan. Mishum Kavod Abrius Hitiru. Continuing on in the Mishnah Berurah's Cut Yud Beis, V'ayid b'masha nichtov l'kamam b'simin shin lamed vav sif hey u'sif ches b'Mishnah Berurah b'ir halacha, where we discuss the details of this halacha further, the question of picking up a moss-covered stone from the ground, and the question of toilish. Ois cotton yud gimel. The Mechaber said we don't have to worry here about toilish. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Ritzon Aloymar. What the Mechaber wants to say is, even though wiping the moss off the stone is, in fact, toilish b'daraisa, you're uprooting the growth of the moss, mimokam gidulai, it grows on the stone, so scraping the moss off the stone is, in fact, the Issa Daraisa of Toilish. But over here, we don't have to concern ourselves with the idea that by using this stone for kinuach, you are, in fact, going to be Toilish the moss from the stone. We don't have to concern ourselves that might happen. Why? Because it's a davar she'ein miskaven, it's something that you have no intent for, and now the key phrase, V'lav psik reishahu. So to wrap this up, why is this mutter? You've got a moss-covered stone. Were you to go ahead and scrape the moss off the stone b'kavana? That would be an issa daraisa of toilish. But that's not what you want to do. You want to use it for kinuach. Now, it could be that by using the stone for kinuach, it could be that when you wipe the stone against your body, you will in fact remove some of the moss. But that's a davar she'ein miskaven, and we paskel like Reb Shimon, a davar she'ein miskaven is mutter, so long as it's not a psik reisha. And we don't view this as a psik reisha. We don't view this as inevitable, that when you use it for kinuach, you're certainly going to remove the moss, and that's why this is mutter. Moving along to Sif Daled, 4 lines off the top of Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber, Lo yitaltel regev adama l'kanech boy. You're allowed to use these stones for kinuach, but you're not allowed to use a clump of earth. So if you want to grab a clump of earth and use the clump of earth for kinuach, that you're not allowed to do. Why not? Says the Mechaber, mipnei she'ein re'uya l'kinuach. Because a clump of dirt is not effective for kinuach. Lefi she'nifreches. A stone could work for kinuach. A stone has structural integrity. When you use it and you wipe it against your body, it will retain its shape and it will effectively wipe away the schmutz off of your body. But if you take a clump of dirt and you try to use it to wipe something off your body, all that's going to happen is the clump of dirt is going to break up and crumble up. So it's not going to be effective. Since it's not going to be effective, Chazal are not matir the Isser Muktzah. The Regev Adama, the clump of dirt, is Muktzah Machmas Gufay, the same way the stone is. By the stone will be matir the Isser Tiltal Muktzah Mishum Kavod Abrius, because it's effective. A clump of dirt is not effective. So we're not going to be matir the Isser of Muktzah. So that's what the Mechaber says. Lo yitaltel regev adam l'kanech boy, mimnei she'ein re'uya l'kinuach, lefi she'nifreches. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Cut Yud Daled. She'ein re'uya l'kinuach, ritzon Aloymar, v'alkein Isser tiltel b'duchtei koi. Since it's not effective, the Isser Muktzah Machmas Gufay, remains in place. We're not going to be matir it. There's no reason to be matir it. Says the Mechaber weiter, 5 lines down, middle of the line. Also, l'kaneach b'cheres. You're not allowed to use a shard of earthenware, a shard of pottery for kinuach, but this has nothing to do really with the Isser, with Hilchas Shabbos. Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do that afilu b'chol. You're not allowed to do that even during the week. This is aser. Mishum sakana, and the reason it's aser is because of sakana, because of danger. Shalo yenatek shiner karkashta, so you should not do damage to the opening of the rectum. The Shinei Karkashta, literally it means the teeth. Shinayim are teeth. Shinei Karkashta, says the Ramah Pirish, Hamayayim Atuluya Befi Tabas, the opening of the large intestine, or the rectum, that is attached to the anal opening, so to speak. My understanding is that this means something to do with the muscles that control the opening and the closing of the opening of the rectum. Somehow you could damage them, you could tear them with a sharp piece of pottery. So you're not allowed to do things where you could risk physical harm to yourself. So says the Mechaber, we're talking about what you could use for kinuach and what you cannot use for kinuach. A shard of pottery you're not allowed to use, forget Hilchos Shabbos. You're not allowed to use it even during the week because of the sakana. Says the Mechaber Vayter Sifhei, Hoyul Lefanav b'Shabbos tzror. Let's say you have pebbles that you could use for kinuach. Now again, pebbles, muktzah makmas gufay, mishum kavod abrius hitiruhu. That's what we're talking about here. So you have tzror, you have pebbles available for kinuach, but you also have another item that's available. Va'oznei cheres chalokim. You also have a smooth piece of pottery. A piece of pottery where there's no risk that you're going to harm yourself. It's smooth. It doesn't have any sharp edges. Now, literally, the words here mean oznei cheres chalokim. The oznayim, the ears of a keli, refer to the handles of a keli. So you have, it sounds like, a piece of a handle of an earthenware keli, which was smooth. So this is not something that can harm yourself. So now, and the Mechaber spells this out, the keved chalokim heim, since these pieces of pottery are smooth, leko mishum sakana. You don't have the isser that we just discussed in Sif Daled. In Sif Daled, we said you can't use a shard of earthenware. Why? Because of sakana. Over here, we're talking about smooth pieces of pottery. So now there's no sakana problem. So now you're faced with a choice. You need something for kinuach. You have the traditional tzror. You have pebbles, or stones. And you remember that the Shulchan Aruch gives a heter, it's really the Gemara that gives the heter, that even though it's muktzah makmas gufay, mishum kavod abrius hitiruhu. But now you have another option. You also have a smooth piece of pottery. Which one should you use? Says the Mechaber, mekanech b'oizen acheres. You should use the piece of pottery handle. That's what you should use. Why? You know why? Because it's not muktzah. Why is it muktzah? Because if it's big enough that you could use it, let's say, to cover a jug, it has Torah's kli. It's considered a keli. If it's a keli, it's not muktzah. So basically, you have a choice. Use muktzah pebbles and rely on the heter, mishum kavod abrius hitiruhu, or use this shard of pottery that is Torah's kli of, that's not muktzah. So better use the thing that's not muktzah. So the Mechaber spells it out. Mekanech b'oizen acheres, use the smooth piece of pottery, shehu roy lechasis b'piakli, which could be used as a cover for a jug, and therefore it's considered a keli, and it's not muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Tesvav, the chalokim heim, we must be speaking about a shard of pottery that's smooth. The be'enam chalokim, if it's not smooth, the yesh shash sakana b'davar, so then there would be a concern of sakana, then mutav yozer lekanech b'tzrar, av shehu muktzah. If you were faced with a choice between relying on the heter of tilpul muktzah, mishum kavod abrius hitiruhu, or using a sharp piece of pottery, then we would tell you, use the heter, mishum kavod abrius, and use the pebbles. Don't use the piece of pottery that's going to bring you to sakana. But over here we're talking about smooth pottery, so there is no issue of sakana. Ois cut tezayin, leko mishum sakana. V'afta adayin yesh pozech shash kishafim, ukedelael b'siman gimel sif yod aleph. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we learned this in Chelek Aleph, in Siman Gimel, and this is brought down from a Gemara in Shabbos, maybe a Gemara Baba Kama, that says that there's another problem with using a piece of pottery. One second. There's another problem of using a piece of pottery. The problem of using a piece of pottery is, if you use a piece of pottery for kinuach, and a little bit of the shmutz from your body remains on the piece of pottery. And now somebody else who is knowledgeable in the field of kishuf, knowledgeable in the field of witchcraft, finds that piece of pottery, he can use it to do something using kishuf to harm you. And therefore in Siman Gimel we learned, do not use a shard of pottery for kinuach. So now we have a new problem here with kinuach, with a shard of pottery. We spoke about sakana, right? So we said don't use a sharp shard of pottery for kinuach. You're not even allowed to use that during the week. Why? Because of sakana. Now we're saying here in Sivhei, if you have a smooth piece of pottery, better use that than pebbles. Why? Because the smooth piece of pottery, especially if it's big enough to cover a jug, Taras Klialov, it's not muksa, it's considered a keli. Asks the Mishnah Berurah, but wait a second. There's another problem with using a piece of pottery, even if it's smooth. The problem of kishuf. How are you going to get around the problem of kishuf? Says the Mishnah Berurah, nevertheless, this problem of kishuf notwithstanding, lo yitiru mishum zeh lekanech b'tzrar shehu muktzah. Faced with a choice of using muktzah pebbles or using a smooth piece of pottery where there's a risk that somebody might use kishuf to get you, we're going to tell you do not use the heter of kavod abrius and use the muktzah pebbles. Better use the smooth piece of pottery. Since you have this piece of pottery which is not muktzah, and it's not a sakana because it's smooth, then you use the pottery, even though there might be a potential risk of kishuf. Certainly, according to the Ramah over there in Siman Gimel, who says that nowadays we don't have people who know how to do this kishuf business, and therefore we don't have to be concerned with this at all. Okay, going weiter in Sifhei, says the Mechaber. Another choice between two items. Tziror va'asavim. You have pebbles and you have grass. Now, grass doesn't literally have to mean, grass like blades of grass. It could mean like a leaf, like you're in a place where there are various weeds growing from the ground. So maybe there's the dandelion leaves. I'm not talking about the flower. I'm talking about the big leaves. So, right? That's something that you could certainly use for kinuach. Now, we're going to assume right now that the Mechaber is talking about leaves or grasses that are detached from the ground. They're laying on the ground, but they're detached from the ground. So you have a choice. You could use tzrar, pebbles, rely on kavod abrius, mishum kavod abrius itiru, or you could use these leaves or these grasses. What should you use? Back to the Mechaber, tzrar va'asavim, yikaneach ba'asavim, you should use the grasses or the leaves, imheim alachim, if they're moist. Aval biyaveshim ein mekanchim, but dry ones you should not use. Why? Mipnei she'em chadim, because they are sharp, umechatchin es habasar, and they could cut you. So again, this is a question of sakana. Now, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting mitzayim, yikaneach ba'asavim. So again, the choice that you were faced with over here was tzrar, pebbles, or a stone. In order to use those, you need to rely on the heter of mishum kavod abrius itiru. Your other choice is to use asavim, to use grass or leaves. Says the Mechaber, use the grasses or the leaves, if they're moist. Says the Mishnah Berurah, yikanech ba'asavim, deloi heavy muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah that these grasses or leaves are not muktzah. Now, the question is exactly why they're not muktzah. And the other interesting thing is that this is based on a rush. And looking up the rush doesn't say a word about muktzah. The rush does not say straight out, use the grass because it's not muktzah. He certainly doesn't explain why they're not muktzah. So there's a lot here between the lines. The Mishnah Berurah is saying very clearly that the reason the Mechaber says use the grass is because the grass is not muktzah. Now, why is grass not muktzah? At first glance, you would think that grass or the leaves of weeds or something should be muktzah machmas gufay, the same way sticks and stones are muktzah machmas gufay. Yet, that would appear not to be the case. There's a lot of talk about it. There are those that want to say that grass and leaves are not muktzah because they could be animal fodder. They're not muktzah because they have other potential usages, and therefore they're not muktzah machmas gufay. There are those that say that that the Mechaber is actually not talking about grass or leaves that are detached from the ground. He's actually talking about ones that are attached to the ground, which goes into now what we're going to see in the next sif. But in the meantime, let's move along to Mishnah Berurah's Yud Ches. Aval b'yaveshim, but dry leaves or grasses you should not use. Ali kanech b'tzrar, rather use the pebbles after hu muktzah, even though they're muktzah and you have to rely on the heter of mishum kavod bris tiru. Issa b'gemara, the Gemara says mutali panis achari ageder destei chaverei. This was actually it's just funny. If you want to know what goes on, a lot of people they like making these behind the scenes videos. If you want to know what goes on behind the scenes, I'll just show you something funny. Issa b'Gemara, it says here in parentheses, Baba Kama Pei Aleph Amid Beis. So I'm in the Mishnah Berurah, and I wanted to look up this Gemara. The Gemara says, given the choice between the pebbles that are muktzah or the asavim yaveshim, the dry grasses. I'm sorry, this Gemara is something else entirely. This Gemara Issa b'Gemara mutali panis achari ageder destei chaveroi. The Mishnah Berurah is bringing down here a Gemara that says that there's a heter. You're out and about, and you need a beis hakisei. So nowadays, you're out and about, you need a beis hakisei, you look for a public building. Back in the day, they didn't have the indoor plumbing situation. So you're out and about, and you need a beis hakisei. So when people needed to go to the beis hakisei, they found a secluded area in the field, and that's where they went. Now, you're walking somewhere, you're looking for a secluded area, and you're walking alongside somebody else's property. So you're walking along somebody else's field. The Gemara says, "Mutali parnei sachari ageder d'stei chaveroi." You're allowed to climb over the stone wall and enter your friend's property, another person's property, and you're allowed to go and do what you need to do. Use the facilities over there in somebody else's property. Now, this is based on a Gemara in Baba Kama. The Gemara in Baba Kama says that there were 10 takonos that Yeshua ben Nun made when he did the Chiluk Haaretz, when he divided up Eretz Yisrael to the Shvatim and gave everybody their piece of Eretz Yisrael. He set 10 conditions. One of the 10 conditions were, yes, it's your private property, but if somebody needs a beis hakisei and the only place that he has available is your property, he's allowed to go over your fence, he's allowed to go into your property, and he's allowed to do what he needs to do. This is a takana that Yeshua ben Nun made. Rishonim say that this takana was not only on the Chiluk Haaretz, and it doesn't only apply to property in Eretz Yisrael, it applies to properties worldwide. This is a halacha that Yeshua ben Nun made. You're allowed to go into somebody else's property when you need it for a beis hakisei. It's not something to laugh at. The Gemara in Brachos says that a person should be mispal. I forgot the pasuk that it's based on. Ad yom lezois yispal kol chasid le'es mitzoi. Lezois yispal kol chasid is a pasuk in Tehillim. Says David HaMelech, lezois yispal kol chasid. This is what every chassid should be mispal for. Le'es mitzoi. That he should find what he needs when he needs it. The Gemara in Brachos gives several different pshatim to this pasuk. One of them is that you should be able to find a beis hakisei when you need a beis hakisei. That's one of the pshatim in this Gemara. So somebody's out and about, he needs to go to the beis hakisei. Yeshua ben Nun said, you're allowed to go into somebody else's property. Now, the behind-the-scenes funny thing that I wanted to tell you is, you'll see here in the Mishnah Berurah that this is quoted from Baba Kama Pei Aleph Amid Beis. Now, it just happens to be that all of the Gemaras that are the source material for all these halachas that we're learning here in Siman Shid Yud Beis, they're all located in Masechta Shabbos, ranging from Daf Pei Aleph Amid Aleph to Daf Pei Beis Amid Aleph. So I'm constantly looking in the Gemaras in Shabbos, going from Pei Aleph Amid Aleph to Pei Beis Amid Aleph. I come to this Gemara, Issa b'Gemara. The Mishnah Berurah says, "Mutali panas achari ageder d'stei chaveroi." You're allowed to go into somebody else's field for the beis hakisei. Think to myself, I don't remember seeing this Gemara in Shabbos, but okay, Pei Aleph Amid Beis. I'm going back and forth in the Gemara, and it's not on Pei Aleph Amud Beis. There's no such Gemara. All right, maybe it's a Toyas Hatfus. Maybe it's on Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. I look at Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. Not there. All right, maybe it's a Toyas Hatfus. Maybe they meant Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Not there. I'm going back and forth. I don't get it. It's not there. Then I realized, whoops, Baba Kama, Pei Aleph Amud Beis. Now, had it been Daf Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis, I wouldn't have made that mistake. I would have noticed the Baba Kama. But because it's Pei Aleph Amud Beis, and I'm constantly busy all morning and all day yesterday with Gemaras and Shabbos on Pei Aleph Amud Beis, my brain assumed right away it was Masechta Shabbos. This cost me about 20 minutes. This mistake. Just give you a good laugh. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Another thing the Gemara says is umuter litar tzrar lekaneach afilu b'Shabbos. If you go into somebody else's land, somebody else's field for the Beis HaKisei, you're allowed to use it for the Beis HaKisei. You're also allowed to take some pebbles and use it for kinuach, and you're allowed to do this even on Shabbos. That's what the Gemara says. And the Mishnah Berurah says, what does that mean? V'hainu min hasodeh. What it means is, you went into somebody else's field, you're using it for the Beis HaKisei, you're allowed to pick up some pebbles or some rocks and use them for kinuach. Aval lo yitol min hageder. But you're not allowed to pull a stone off of the stone wall. Afilu begeder av, even if it's a thick wall, de'ein oisen nekev, so that by pulling out a stone, you're not going to make a hole going all the way through the wall. It's a thick wall. You're pulling out a stone. You're still not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Dinire kisoiser. What's the Mishnah Berurah saying here? So the truth is that this is really a machlekes rishonim. The Gemara says you're allowed to go into your chaver's property, and you're allowed to use it for the Beis HaKisei. And the Gemara says when you go in there, you're allowed to take a stone, and you're allowed to use a stone for kinuach, and you're even allowed to do it on Shabbos. Some Rishonim learn that what that means is you're allowed to take a stone off of the geder, off of the stone wall. You're allowed to take off a stone. Why? Because if it's a thick wall, you're not going to make a hole all the way through. Since you're not going to make a hole all the way through, it's not stira daraisa. It's only stira darabanan. And stira darabanan, we could be mate, mishum kavod b'risitiru. Other Rishonim would say, no, we wouldn't be mate you to take a stone off of the stone wall, even if it's only stira darabanan. You're still not allowed to do it. What does the Gemara mean that you can take pebbles? It means off the ground. You can take pebbles. And it's the same we should cover the braysi tiru that we've been dealing with until now to be matir tiltal muktzah. Okay, moving along to Sivav. Says the Mechaber, B'kanchid b'Shabbos ba'asavim lachim, you're allowed to use moist grasses and leaves that are attached to the ground for kinuach, afilu heim mechubarim, even if they're still attached to the ground, ubilvad shelo yizizem, so long as you do not move them. We'll see what that means in the Mishnah Berurah. Umishum mishtamish b'mechubar leka. Okay, so we're talking here about using grasses or leaves or some such items that are attached to the ground for kinuach. If you're visualizing this in your mind, so I guess, you have something that's relatively long, so you could manipulate it and you could use it to do what you need to do without uprooting it from the ground, right? So one problem that you might come up with right away in the context of Hilchos Shabbos is, generally speaking, we know that you're not allowed to be mishtamish b'mechubar. You're not allowed to make use of things that are attached to the ground. Now, really, that refers to a tree. You're not allowed to be mishtamish b'ilon on Shabbos. Why not? Because there's a fear if we allow you to use a tree on Shabbos, you might come to break a branch off the tree. Why would you break a branch off a tree? To use it as a switch, to hit an animal or something. So it's Xera. There's really no Issa Daraisa in being Mishtamish Be'ilam. In Daraisa, you could climb a tree. Why not? There's an Issa Darabanan to climb a tree. There's an Issa Darabanan to hang your jacket on a tree. There's an Issa Darabanan to hang your hat on a tree. Why? It's Mishtamish Be'ilan. That's an Isser. Do you have a problem over here of Mishtamish B'mechubar to use this leaf or something that's attached to the ground, this weed that's attached to the ground for kinuach? Says the Mechaber, no, not a problem. The Isser Mishtamish B'Chover is referring to trees, maybe even a small tree, a sapling. Avaloi b'yerek. Yerek literally means a vegetable. Over here it doesn't mean a vegetable, a zucchini. It means vegetation, low-lying vegetation. That's not a tree. There is no Isser of Mishtamish B'Mechuber. Now again, what we have to look at the Mishnah Berurah to understand is, the Mishnah Berurah said you could use these asavim. The Mechaber said, Ubavad shelo yezizem, so long as you don't move them. Now certainly, if you're using it for kinuach, you're moving it. So what does that mean, as long as you don't move it? So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yotes, Shelo Yazizem. The Mishnah Berurah learns, Hainu shelo yishmait oisam mimakom chiburam misham klisha. The Mishnah Berurah seems to learn over here that it means that you're not uprooting it. What does Shelo Yazizem means? It means that you don't uproot it. Because if you uproot it, you're being toilish. Being toilish is a daraisa. That you can't do. But as long as you're not uprooting it, you're just moving it around, that's okay. Now, you're still moving muktzah, but all right, we're matter tiltul muktzah because of kavod abrius. Interesting, the Aruch HaShulchan seems to say that this is not actually called tiltul of muktzah. Why? He seems to say that when something is attached to the ground, and you let it remain attached to the ground, and you just move the loose part around, that's not called tiltul. Why? Because tiltul, generally speaking, means to move something out of its place. As long as it's attached to the ground, even if it's like a relatively long leaf, right? So you have a leaf like this, and you take it and you move it from here to here, right? You bend it over from this side to that side, but it's still attached to the ground. You would look at it, you say, it's tiltul, I moved it from here to there. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to suggest, since it remains affixed to the ground, in the same spot that it always was, that's not even called tiltul of muktzah. Okay, says the Mechaber Vayter Siv Zayin, Hayatzarech l'nikavav ve'ena yachal lipanos. Somebody was suffering from constipation. Now, back in the day, before they had the medications, I guess, that we have nowadays, Miralax, Uchedema, when somebody was suffering from constipation, the doctor recommended refuah for constipation was to use something to manipulate the anal opening, to physically go ahead and open up the opening, and that would do something to alleviate the problem of constipation. And that's what the Mechaber is going to be busy with over here in Siv Zayin and Siv Ches. Somebody needs to go, but he can't. Constipation. The known refuah was to manipulate the rectal opening. What they used to do was take a smooth stone, so they can't hurt themselves, and they would use it to manipulate and open up the opening. Says the Mechaber, you cannot do this on Shabbos the same way you would do it during the week. And he identifies that. When they would do it during the week, they would firmly grasp the stone that they were using with their entire hand. You should not do that on Shabbos. Why? Mishum hasharas nimin. Because when you grasp the stone that way and you use it for this purpose, it's considered a psik resha, it's considered inevitable that there are hairs growing in that place, and by pushing and manipulating over there, you will uproot a hair. And that would be an issa daraisa. And it's a psik resha that it should happen. Ella rather, memashmesh kala achar yad. Rather, you should do this in an abnormal way. What's the abnormal way? The Mechaber identifies it. Instead of firmly grasping the stone with your whole hand, you should only hold it with two fingers, and you should do it that way. So before we go to the Mishnah Berurah, let's just make sure we have straight the halacha that the Mechaber says. Then we can see the explanation of it. Again, constipation, the known refuah was to use something to manipulate the rectal opening to help it open up. Says the Mechaber, you cannot do this on Shabbos in the normal way you would do it during the week. Why? What's the issue? The issue is hasharas nimin. The issue is cutting out or pulling out hairs in that place which would be an Issa Daraisa. So what should you do, says the Mechaber? You should do it in an abnormal way. What's the abnormal way? Instead of grasping the stone firmly with your whole hand, only grasp it with 2 fingers and do what you need to do it in that way. What is the heter that the Mechaber is giving you here? If it's a psik reisha that you're going to remove hairs, and the removing hairs is a daraisa, so what's the heter over here by holding the stone in an abnormal way only for 2 fingers? So let's take a look here at what the Mishnah Berurah says. The Mishnah Berurah says, Mishum Asharas Niman, the problem over here is removing hairs. Du Bechlal Toilish. That would be the Issa Daraisa of Toilish, of uprooting something, Mimakum Gidulai. Now, even though this is certainly a davar she'eino miskaven, you're not trying to shave. You're not trying to cut ears. You're trying to relieve your constipation. So it's definitely a davar she'eino miskaven. Psik reisha hu al yedei mishpush. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this would be aser because it's a psik reisha. It's considered inevitable that it should happen. Lo yamashrish b'tzrar. Okay, now. First, the Mishnah Berurah makes a tangential point. Lo yamashresh b'tzrar shalakinuach lahachlikoi shalo yisarit b'sari k'der shuayis b'chayil mishum mamachek ele kala achayad. The Mishnah Berurah makes a tangential point here. When you're doing this, you might also be tempted to smooth out the stone because you're using the stone for what you're using it for. You don't want to cut yourself. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you cannot go ahead and smooth out the stone in the normal way, because that would be the Issa Daraisa of memachik, of smoothing something out. Instead, you should do it kalachayad. Now let's go weiter here. So again, what did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber said, you want to use this stone, we're afraid it's a psik reisha. It's considered inevitable that you're going to cut hairs. That would be an Isser of Toilish. Therefore, you need to do it in an abnormal way. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber said, you should hold the stone with 2 fingers, umimashmesh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, and this is a critical Mishnah Berurah, umimashmesh benachas. And you should gently manipulate the rectal opening. You should do it gently. He brings us down to the Beis Yosef b'Shem Rabbeinu Yerucham v'achi isel kamal b'Seif Siman Shin Chavches. What's at work here? So when you learn this Mechaber, there's 2 different ways that you could learn this Mechaber. One way you could learn the Mechaber is, the Mechaber is telling you, when you go to do this with the stone, there's an Issa Daraisa problem of Toilish. And even though it's a davar she'eino miskaven, it's a psik reisha. So you have a real problem that you need to get around. Says the Mechaber, the way you should get around it is by doing it kalachayad. Now, kalachayad literally means with the back of your hand, but kalachayad is code, especially in Shabbos, for doing something with a shinui. Now, when you do something with a shinui, it turns it from an Issa Daraisa to an Issa Darabana. So Toilish is an Issa Daraisa. But if you do Toilish with a shinui, it's only an Issa Darabana. So one way to understand this Mechaber is that, listen, you've got a Toilish problem over here. Says the Daraisa. Says the Mechaber, you know what the way around it is? Do it kalachayad. Do it with a shinui. Now that it's a shinui, it's a darabanan. Now that it's a darabanan, no problem. Mishum kavod abrius itiruhu. It's only an issa darabanan. And what we're doing over here, you need to be mashmesh because of constipation. No, mishum chayli maybe. You're doing it kalachayad. You're doing it with a shinui. We'll be mad to it. Now the problem is this is not kavod abrius. Till now we were talking about cleaning yourself. That's kavod abrius. This is not kavod abrius. This is like refuah. Okay, but that's not the way the Mishnah Berurah learns this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton, right? Chaf Aleph, umimashmesh benachas. You should hold the stone. Don't grip the stone firmly with your whole hand like you do it during the week. Only grip the stone with 2 fingers, and then be memashmish. Then manipulate the opening. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but you should do it benachas. You should do it gently. Seems that the way the Mishnah Berurah is learning the Mechaber is the heter over here is not a heter of shinui to turn the Toilish Daraisa into Toilish Darabanan. The heter over here is we're turning it from a psik reisha into a non-psik reisha. Like this, if you would manipulate the opening in the way you do it all the time, you would hold the stone firmly with two hands, and then you would go do what you have to do, then it would be considered a psik reisha that you're going to uproot hairs. That's a problem of toilish. But if you grip it only with two fingers and you do it gently, now it's not a psik reisha that you're going to uproot any hairs. If it's not a psik reisha, so it's a davar she'eino miskavin. So davar she'eino miskavin, it's mutter. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time at Sivches. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This listen to limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should send Yeshua Sefurus Parnaset Sheduchim Tolol Zanid. We should be zeichet to see the B'Yeskel Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.